everyone. On behalf of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, I would like to welcome you to the fifth lecture in our 2021 lecture series entitled Fighting for Souls, Religion and Spirituality in Barbados. This evening's lecture on African spirituality and religion in the Caribbean from slavery to the present will be given to us by Dr. Derek Murray. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Curtis Jacobs, who will be chairing the lecture. A reminder of our housekeeping rules: all comments and conversations must be placed in the chat. Any questions for Dr. Murray should be placed in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and all participants will be muted as a courtesy. I will now hand over to Curtis Jacobs, who will give his remarks and then introduce Dr. Murray. You're on mute. Curtis, you're on mute.
You would. Yes, good evening. It is both an honor and a privilege to be asked to chair this session. It is on a subject with which I have become very interested, and when I was asked and I agreed to do this, I remembered two things, maybe three. The first one is that I was sitting at a lecture in Barbados. I don't remember the exact place, but I suspect it may have been the Frank Collymore. And we were listening to a lecture by Dr. Molefe Asante, and he was making the point that Afrocentricity is essentially an African response to phenomena. If you're Afrocentric, your first response to anything should be African, words to that effect. And I also remembered, as I was sharing with Derek the other day, a particular piece I wrote about a particular play which was set in Barbados, and which was actually performed in Barbados. I don't know if it was ever performed anywhere else. And I'm looking at it. This is back in probably 2003 or 4. And they are discussing what is now called the Buses Rebellion. And I'm sitting there looking, and I'm saying, so you mean to say for this whole thing, the first major and the only major overt slave rebellion in Barbados, and it is not even preceded by a prayer or any kind of religious observance? I said, this is crazy. And I also remembered John Mbiti. Africans are notoriously religious. They take religion anywhere they go. So for spirituality, I would say in this case, my working definition would be a way of accepting the fact that there is a spiritual force in the universe larger than all of mankind. That is a John Henry Clark in 1996. And African spirituality is what I say is a holistic concept that stems from the historical, cultural, and religious heritage of Africa. And Africans in the Caribbean, with which we are most familiar, and most of the history in which we are taught do not quite accept the view that they were Africans in the Americas long before 1492. but the history of Africa in the Caribbean after 1492, and when we find the information before that as well, the history of African spirituality is really the history of the African presence in our part of the world. How did we manage to cope and to survive in a world which we did not create, a world over which we had little control, and how did we survive, and how did we thrive to reach the position that we are today. And I also remember another matter. I was writing a piece several years ago about Granville Williams and the Sons of God Apostolic Spiritual Baptist Church. And I wrote, Granville succeeded in awakening an African religious sensibility that not even 3 centuries of British colonial rule could quite erase. And having said all that, it is my honor, my privilege to introduce Derek Murray, Dr. Derek Murray, who has agreed to present this afternoon's lecture or talk. So, Derek, we have lost contact for probably what, more than 10 years, I think. But we've only been just reunited a couple of weeks ago. And I see he's been doing good work. And I look forward to hearing his presentation. Over to you, Derek.
Yes, I was saying, Curtis, that I remember our early days at the History Forum at UWI Cave Hill. And Dr. Innes, Tara Innes, has taken that to new heights. Now it's an institution in Barbados now. Dr. Tara Innes.
Oh, Tara Innes. Oh, yes.
Yes. And she's now in charge of it. And that's the History Forum.
Oh,
yes.
Good.
So, and that's a crucible that for historians and a lot of important work is happening there. I want to thank the Barbados Museum and the Historical Society and the University of the West Indies Cave Hill for inviting me to this important lecture series on spirituality generally in Barbados, but for me to deal with the issue of African spirituality. It is not a straightforward topic to deal with because it involves trying to understand and analyze European ways of knowing and knowledge systems versus African knowledge systems. And when you speak of African spirituality, you're speaking about African knowledge systems. And to be able to put that on all fours with European science and to trace the history in the Caribbean region without being using the resources or using science to judge African systems of knowledge. And as a historian, we have to be able to study these two systems symmetrically. And that is not what is usually done. Very often, one is judged by the other. I want to thank everyone who's here for taking the time out on behalf of myself and my agency, the Center for Hybrid Studies. And I will jump right into what African spirituality looks like, African spiritual technology looks like. This is my own ceremony for my Orisha or Shosi, for my birthday ceremony. Pay attention to the implements.
Yes.
Ritual, prayer, shrines, other artifacts that make up African technology. Collective work, communing, community, these are the components of African spiritual technology. So dancing, drumming, artifacts, shrines, the exchange of forces, that's what makes up African spiritual technology. I'm using the word technology on purpose. I know it's not usually associated with things spiritual. People don't usually put the two together. I know of at least two other scholars that will use the word spiritual technology, the phrase, but this is precisely what I call it. And I'll show you another example, this time on the continent in Cape Coast. This is another example of African spiritual technology. It's communing with the ancestors, but this is the Cape Coast Castle where enslaved Africans from the interior were held before being shipped off under horrid conditions. And they were held in this place, for days in blood, urine, feces, until, the mud on the bottom of this castle. This is the dungeons in the castle, under the castle. It's inches high. And this is when I visited with my associate, and she took the video, and we had a slight argument because she was asking me why I took it on myself to go and sit at the people's altar next to the priest. And I had to tell her, and then we had video evidence that the priest actually called me to sit there and directed me to sit there. So I wasn't doing I wasn't being presumptuous. And so now I have witnesses, but you can see that he's calling me to come and sit there. But I want you to pay special attention to the shrine, the white cloth, candles, and other implements that make up African spiritual technologies. And in a moment, he will stand up and do his libation, which is important for the exchange of ashe, for the exchange of energy for communing with the spirits. So this is the priest, and he is now going to perform the libation. I remember this is on the continent, and we know that we perform libations on this side of the Atlantic as well. And he's performing the libation with gin, and we perform libations with water and with rum. So this is how we commune with our ancestors. The technology is really the exchange of life force, and you'd find that all of the African traditions have a philosophy of the exchange of life force. For the Yoruba, we call it Ashe. The Akan call it Okra. The Tiv call it Tisav. Igbo call it Chi. And the closest that Western science has come to is perhaps the concept of energy. But of course, energy in science is really the exchange of activity of inert matter, and does not convey the same meaning as the exchange of life force. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I started to do this work. I believe that African knowledge and the belief in and the beliefs and the acceptance of African ontology is, well, it's not accepted and it's not valued. And that is because of the march and the dominance of Western science ever since the scientific revolution, and the expansion of Western culture. The notion that spirits are real, exchanges of life force and so on is real in terms of African technology, has been relegated to the realm of speculation for anthropologists who are studying the symbolisms, or sociologists who view these entities as mere means of individuals trying to fight oppression or gain power in society, or maybe even scientists who view them as psychosomatic anomalies and so on, or rather than actual real entities in their own right. So I, for a while, for a place like Barbados, where people think that this is the least African of the Caribbean islands, it has very little African culture, African retentions. That's what people normally think. But we know that we have, we can see African retentions all around. And if you're talking about plants, you're talking about the fact that we pick them, 6 at a time for our medicine, or 7, the number is important. The time of day that you pick them is important, and so on. If you ask people, the older people in the country, they will tell you that. My sister, who's a Jehovah's Witness, I went by her once, and she had cactus in the front, cactus plant in the front of her house, planted. And I asked her about them, and she said, "Oh, they're there to keep away the spirits." So, even my sister who's a Jehovah's Witness, she still has some African spiritual retentions, and we take that as a normal part of our cultural heritage. But they're in bits and pieces. In a place like Barbados, there is no coherent system of one African spiritual tradition, like Cuba, for example, or maybe even Trinidad. But it dawned on me that if we have these fragments of proverbs and sayings and small bits of technology of what to do to for spirits not to pass you out of, to follow you out of the graveyard, and the ritual of passing children over the coffin so that the ancestor wouldn't return in that child and so on. If we have those, then perhaps maybe there was some coherent scientific, for lack of a better word, system of knowledge that held together all of these fragments, which we've lost in Barbados in large part, but which is still held elsewhere. Of course, my first degree is in biology. I'm a biologist first at KFIL, when the faculty was called Natural Sciences. And I wanted to do this research work. And so naturally, that's the place I went. I wanted to sneak in under the guise of ethnobotany and see if I could make sense of the heritage that we have of plant spirituality, and if it made a coherent system. Of course, science and technology, natural sciences was having none of that. My supervisor honestly told me that that's not science that you're trying to do. And so they looked around and saw who would accept me. And history gave me refuge. They said, you could come over here and you could study that thing and we would accept you. And so I left science and technology. You could see me walking across there in the slide from science and technology and going over to humanities, crossing on top of the library, which will accept anybody, regardless of the system of knowledge. And so that's how I got interested in this topic and this work. But I became more interested when I realized that this is probably the last battleground for Pan-Africanists. Accepting our systems of knowledge and our ways of knowing and being, and having them judge equally, regardless of the space, is the last frontier for Pan-Africanists and emancipation, for mental emancipation, and for our battles. And so, for example, science is welcomed in the courtroom. Western science is welcomed in the courtroom. Western science is welcomed in political policy of governments and so on. Very rarely you will find the knowledge systems of traditional peoples, whether African or not, being accepted and judged on their own merit. I will tell you up front now that part of the methodology that I use is that we are prohibited from using one system of knowledge to judge another. So as a historian, I wouldn't use the findings and the results of Western science to judge the reality and the value and validate other systems of knowledge. And in my case, particularly African systems of knowledge. So we're speaking about West Africa now in Barbados and the Caribbean. And I thought it was significant that the university built the Ashanti Stool. I think that we still need to do some publicity on this. So there are some people that think that that's a Chinese building, but it's an Ashanti Stool. And I have not gotten around to, and you know, it was Sir Hilary's, Professor Sir Hilary's vision. And I think it's a great, it's an excellent symbolic bridging of the gap between the continent and this hemisphere. I haven't gotten around to telling Sir Hilary as yet that with the building of the Ashanti Stools, which is, you know, the Ashanti Stool is the symbol of royalty and the seat of power for the Ashanti Kingdom. And what many people don't know is that while their lives, alive kings have to sacrifice blood for these stools, on these stools, for the time when they pass. And I think that there's still much blood, sweat, and tears that we have left to shed before we can properly say that that stool is fully initiated. Yes, consecrated is the word. So the stool is really West Africa in Barbados. So we should really speak about how Africa and Europe came to the Caribbean. I'll use the particular case of Barbados, and we'll go to the very start with Ligon in the mid 17th century. It's not the mid 17th century. Yes, about the mid 17th century, 1630s and 40s. And he wrote on his observations in Barbados. And he had an encounter with an African. And I represent this African as Ogun. We have no way of, it's unlikely that he was a child of Ogun. We have no way of knowing in any case. But Ogun is really the founder of civilization. And both Ligon and this African were there trying to reform, reproduce, reorchestrate, reinitiate their respective cultures, their respective life ways in a new space called Barbados. And what brought them together was a compass. And you could hear and see, we don't have time for me to go through the exact language and so on, but you could hear and see in the conversation that they had that these two men were coming from two different worldviews, two completely different worldviews. And they were about to embark on orchestrating a new vision, sometimes using new materials, but at the same time retaining their old ways of knowing. And so Ligon tried to explain the compass to the African, and the African asked about why it moved this way, why it moved that way. Ligon tried to explain using notions of the lodestone and so on, and that it points north all the time. And the African asked him a curious question that he thought was irrational and primitive, but in the African's worldview, it was a perfectly rational and sensible question. And the African asked him whether the compass was alive. Now, of course, in Europe, they were already at the start of the scientific revolution where they were looking at matter as inert and not alive. But for Africans and for many other cultures, it was possible that life pervaded everything. And so that was the start of two worldviews in a Caribbean space in Barbados. I want to go very quickly into what the Africans were doing with spiritual forces in Barbados. I will focus specifically on Obe for war. So there are many types of Obe, but there's particular types of Obe for war. But before I do that, I just want to quickly tell you that I will treat African entities and spirits and forces as real. I'm not treating them as though there's some other system of knowledge, some other reasoning somewhere that will find them out to be unreal. And so there's no knowledge system out of Europe and science that will say and validate them or invalidate them. And in saying that, I want to point out that I'm not giving any special privilege to knowledge. Knowledge is not something that approximate some ideal absolute truth. My approach to knowledge is the same as Bruno Latour, who's a science studies theorist, and a few other theorists, and that power and knowledge are exactly the same thing. They're forces. This is not to be confused with Foucault's contention that power relations determine knowledge, which is confused by some other people that knowledge is power. What he actually said is power relations determine knowledge. What I'm actually saying is that power and knowledge are the same thing. They're both forces. And so I'm not giving any special privilege to Western scientific knowledge to validate or invalidate anybody else's knowledge. And in this case, African systems of knowledge. So since the scientific revolution in the last 400 years, Europe sees the reality in a particular way. And this way is quickly summarized on the left hand of this slide, where we have modern Europe. We don't have time to go into all the details, but what you really need to know is that there's a great divide between nature and culture, our society. Society being a rational culture. You can have many cultures because cultures don't actually know anything. People just have cultural beliefs. And in terms of nature, which is understood by rational science, you can have all of these things in the world which are different, but soon they will be unified by one scientific reason. And that is what scientists are working on. The point I want to make is that that is just one way to divide up and understand and try to understand reality. Africans do it differently. They see the world as unified, and they develop all of these different forces in trying to reason about the world. And you can have several paths to reasoning and several reasons for understanding and several ways of understanding the world. So Western science they have many things in the world that are alienated and separate from one another. You unite them with one reason, but then you have all these superfluous cultures that don't, you can have many of them because they don't actually know anything. But you can only have one science. You can only have one knowledge. I'm saying that way of thinking out of Europe is only one reality, and that we have to understand that there are other realities that are just as valid and will be, and we need a system that can understand them in the Caribbean, where you have both of them contended, that can understand and discuss both of them without bringing one to judge the other. So I developed an entire model for this. I'm not going to go into the details of it because time wouldn't permit me. It's called tachontology, where I use the Tukban to understand 3 levels of reality: an improvisational level, where as soon as we land in a new space, an African or European land in a new space such as the Caribbean, you use the penny whistle level to improvise. You come up with ideas, and you have to do that because the materials are new, the environment is new. But while you're improvising, you don't just improvise any or how. You have to use the way of knowing that you arrive with. So if you're an African diviner arriving in the Caribbean naked without your implements, or an African dancer, you still have the muscle memory, or you still have the memory of how you divine, and you use the materials at hand. So you improvise with the way of knowing. And then there's the final level that you actually make things. You make institutions, you make drums, you make products, you redo your rituals. And that's the foundational level. So whereas creolization by Kamau Brathwaite, for example, or Aisha Khan may just simply say cultural merging, we really need to see that there are 3 different levels, and these 3 different levels mix at different rates. So for example, ways of knowing, the middle level, the kettle drum level, not the boom drum level, the kettle drum level in the middle, ways of knowing how we classify and organize our work. That level, because very often it's based on assumptions that we don't consciously think about, much of it is unconscious. That level changes very slowly, it hardly changes. Up until now, we still think and operate in a very African way. Even, if you're practicing Christianity, you're practicing Christian, very often we still do it in a very African way. But the materials are new, the ideas, some of the ideas are new, because we needed a Bible and so on. You'll get into that some more. So that is tachontology. And if somebody has further questions at the end, I can always come back to this slide and go into further detail. The one thing I will add is that if you look in this corner of the slide up here, you'll see this thing looking like an abyss. And whenever this is where we go for creativity, this is where we go for ideas. This is where artists and scientists go in their quiet times. In music, I call it silent. So in the tukban, you have the penny whistle, the middle drum, the boom drum. But these are the silent notes in between. And this is where it is easy to change things and play around with ideas because they're not yet articulated or connected or linked to other things in the world. And, and as a creative, we go back and forth from, you could call that heaven if you want, back down to earth every now and then. I'm saying that to say that Africans in the Caribbean had to use their imagination, had to improvise through their ways of knowing to build new institutions. Europeans had to do the same as well. And it is in building those new institutions that we ended up with new forms and new forces in the Caribbean. So we have Obe, for example, Mayal, Vudun, Kumfa, Orisha. I should say a word about Obe. There's no, that we know of, coherent system of African spirituality called Obe. There's OB that White Planter overheard an African, probably Igbo, using that term and associated it with all the forms of African spirituality that they saw. And they began to call everything Obe that looked African. They weren't concerned about this. It's like somebody running into one Christian with a Bible, and then every person that you saw with a Bible was Anglican, without regard for Catholics and Pentecostal and Seventh-day Adventists and so on. So I'm focusing on British West Indies. I'm not, able to deal with, nor it's not my area of expertise to deal with Cuba, for example, or in too much detail with Trinidadian Orisha and so on. But my work is mostly focused on the influence of Obe. Having said that, with the caveat that when planters in the historical record, when the whites record the word Obe, they could very well have been talking about any spiritual system that the Africans were using. Yes. As soon as they saw it and it looked African, they called it Obe. Mm-hmm. Now, just another note, Obe, African spirituality, was fully entangled with war or rebellions and revolts. So the focus of this lecture will be on Obe for war and how that changed over time because of a paradigm shift. Before I do that, I just need to say something very quickly about paradigms and paradigm shifts. A paradigm is a system of knowledge, a way of knowing. Thomas Kuhn coined the term in the 60s. He was a physicist, come philosopher, who studied the history of science as well. He was expecting to see that science progress by these small steps, bit by bit, but he saw that they took sometimes, you had to start over, you had to have a revolution, and you had to discard an entire paradigm to start with a new paradigm. We call them paradigm shifts. But the important thing to know is that a paradigm is a set of fundamental assumptions that scientists subscribe to and they use for their research and assumptions. You know, all knowledge systems start with assumptions, whether you're African, whether you're Indian, whether you're a scientist. Even mathematicians start with axioms. And these assumptions often go unnoticed unless you're a philosopher or you are interested in the foundations. And they're handed down from one generation to the next without being questioned. But when there's a problem, when you're not getting the answers you're supposed to get as in scientists, for example, Newton was not getting the answer. Newton's laws stood for 200 years until Einstein was not getting the answers he wanted. And he reformulated the laws completely. He started with new assumptions, and that was a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And I'm not veering too far from what we're talking about, African spirituality. I wanted to say that because I want to establish in your head that between the 17th century, between the start of the sugar revolution in the British West Indies and emancipation, there was a paradigm shift in the way that African obe was used. Obe for war. And initially, we had an African type obe in the early phase. And I want you to remember this because I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail immediately. But we had an African phase where Africans were trying to reestablish their ways of knowing their life ways by having a revolution and setting up their own kings and so on across the Caribbean. And these failed. And this happens in science as well. When a scientific theory begins to fail, it doesn't correspond with the results that you expect. Then you have a crisis where nothing happens for a while and people are re-examining the foundations and the assumptions. And after that, what Kuhn called extraordinary science. And for us, it would be obe sages. And by the way, I use the word sages rather than priests when I'm speaking about African spiritual technologists and leaders and so on. When African sages were questioning the foundations and the assumptions about their own obe medicine. And then once they developed a new paradigm, once they got new materials and ideas, they started a new phase, which was the Creole phase. And so before we get fully, before we get fully into the African phase, I want to point out a pattern that was noticed by Michael Creighton in his book, Testing the Chains. And so that you don't think that I'm just making up this pattern. There's a pattern where there's an early active African phase of resistance. And this early phase was led by Africans. When I say Africans, I mean Africans born in Africa and brought to the Caribbean. This early phase, the plots were always being organized by people, Africans directly from the continent. This was because it was early. In the early days, you had most of the time the planters had to bring Africans directly from Africa because they worked them to death. They didn't live to have the next generation. Over time, you started to get Africans born in the Caribbean, the Creoles. So the early plots were led by Africans born in Africa. And then you had a lull in the rhythm of resistance. There was very little resistance activity. When I say resistance, I don't mean individual acts of resistance. I mean collective resistance, getting ready for war. Mm-hmm. And after that lull, then we saw a renewed, a resurgence of resistance activity. Of course, the timing of these phases depended on the local conditions on each island. But historians like Michael Creighton and Sir Hilary, wanting to give some agency to the Africans themselves, the enslaved Africans themselves, rejected the notion that this rhythm was caused mostly by external factors occurring in Europe being more gentle with the Africans, or the planters being more less harsh with the or harsher depending on the planter, and that those conditions, or the military presence and so on. They wanted to say, to point out that this pattern was not mostly external, that it had some internal agency, but they ascribed that agency to class conflict. And they set up a dichotomy between elite Africans and other Africans. And the argument was that these elite Africans, depending on the tensions between the elite Africans and the other Africans, they either got together to collectively battle the whites or not. I'm pointing out in this lecture that maybe those factors were important, but a key factor was also the potency of obey for war, the obey that they use in preparing for war, in divining to strategize for the war, in preparing medicine to protect them during the war. So before we get into the British West Indies, I want to point out the inspirational story of the Saramacca in Suriname. The Saramacca, they have a period that they call first time. And this first time, by the way, this is work that I'm taking from Richard Price. This first time is demarcated as a part of the enslaved period when they were fighting the wars with the white planters. And the Saramacca say that the people who fought the war, they call them the old-time people, or the people who heard the guns of war. And these are the ancestors. And these old-time people were the people who manipulated and managed potent obey medicine, obey rituals for war. Now, the Saramacca won their war against the planters. The rest of the British West Indies, the plots were always discovered, as you will soon see. But the Saramacca won their war with the planters, and they had a peace. It's called the Peace at Sentia. And this peace at Sentia in 1762, what they did was that they set up a shrine to mark this peace, this winning of the war. But it is important when you are in times of peace not to invoke potent forces of war from obey. So what the Saramacca did was to decommission. They decommissioned the old-time people. And so they built this shrine as a way of decommissioning the old-time people. It's dedicated to the old-time people, the ancestors who heard the guns of war. And they prohibit the youth from going there to invoke the first-time people. There's a 70-year-old elder, according to Richard Price, by the name of Amika. He warned that, in his words, first time kills people and should never be taught to the youth. In other words, don't go to that shrine to invoke any forces unless you're preparing for a crisis like a pandemic or a drought or a war. And because what could happen is that those forces will be invoked and they will be violent and they're dangerous. And so today in Suriname, you have two groups of ancestors that are invoked. The ancestors that assist with the daily living in times of peace, and the old-time people that you invoke for epidemics, for drought, and I will add for war. This represents the model for first time, for early African phase obey. Now, the Saramacca never had to invent another type of Obe because they won their war. That was the end of the evolution of the Obe in Suriname. So they didn't have to go past an African phase of Obe. But in the British West Indies, we weren't so lucky, or we weren't so potent with our Obe. And there could be several reasons for this. I'll mention them in a moment. But the African phase for orchestrating wars before 1800, in Barbados, in Antigua, and in Jamaica and Tobago, there were plots throughout that period. And all of these plots were revealed before the plots could make it to actual revolt. Okay. So throughout the wars across each phase, revolutionary leaders were advised by spiritual sages. In other words, everywhere you saw a leader for a plot, and these leaders were from Africa, born in Africa, the leader was accompanied by a sage, a priest, a spiritual advisor. It was the same in Haiti with Boukman. So you always had the leader and the advisor. These early plots were led by sages born in Africa. And these sages from Africa had internalized the full reality of African orchestrations. So the African phase, like for first time, invoked specialized war medicine against the whites and their sorcery. It's important to bear in mind that for Africans who were leading these plots, there was no doubt that Obe was real, that it was potent, it was strong enough to do what it had to do, right? So these sages divined, they advised and administered oaths of secrecy using Obe. These oaths often included blood sacrifices and grave dirt, but in every case, the Obe failed. The technology failed. So you had enslaved Africans in Barbados that plotted in 1649, we plotted in 1675, we plotted in 1683, and we plotted in 1686. The ability of the Africans to work in secret was noted from the time of the 1675 plot, when Coromantee men planned for at least 3 years without being discovered. But then they were betrayed by another enslaved African, and this resulted in the death of several sages. One of them, while being interrogated as he was about to be killed, asked for a drink of water. It seems that this was the custom before they could reveal anything. What this says to me is that if you're asking for water before you reveal anything, chances are you went through a ritual or oath before you became part of the leadership of the plot. So he was asking for water to nullify the consequences of breaking the secret oath. So this says to me that Obe, all I'm trying to point out to you is that in these plots, Obe was central to keeping secrecy, to protecting, and to planning strategy. So by the final decade of the 1600s, you're now having Barbadian-born elite Blacks at the center of planning the revolts. You're having Creole Blacks who has never been in Africa to see the full orchestration, all of the infrastructure, all of the reality of African forces. They're now at the center of these revolts. But yet still, they're using, the Africans are still there with the knowledge and using Obe to create secret societies. So they planned the 1692 revolt as usual. And this created a secret society using Obe oath. Again, this plot was betrayed. But now note that you're having Creoles born in Barbados not as fully convinced about the reality of African Obeah forces as the Africans born in Africa. And so they lost some confidence in the potency of the Obeah. However, confidence wasn't completely lost. 9 years later, another plot was uncovered. This is in Barbados in 1701. Again, African Creoles now were dominant in the leadership of this plot. And the discovery of this plot damaged confidence in the Obeah War for Medicine, that collective plotting for war subsided in Barbados until 1816, when you had the Bussa Rebellion. So my position is that although there were several external factors such as geography, the strength of the militia, the control of movement among enslaved Africans that contributed to the hiatus, at the heart of this stability and internal to the life ways of Africans born in Barbados was this loss of confidence in African war medicine. So I turn to Antigua. In Antigua, any Obeah war medicine that might have been used to seal the secrets of their 1729 Christmas plot by enslaved Africans failed as whites found out about the plans. The Attorney General, however, felt that the design laid much deeper than yet imagined, and he was not wrong. So it wasn't surprising that the Obeah diviners were among the leaders of another conspiracy 6 years later in 1836. It is clear that the system of using Obeah to form secret war societies was also very evident in Antigua. According to reports, one of the fighters was seen taking an oath at his own house, quote, open quote, to quote, at his own house, 3 Sundays running to head, that is to kill white people. Other enslaved blacks took the oath. According to the report, a slave by the name of Sekundi initiated Johnny and John Pierce Kweku on the first Sunday. So they were doing this work on Sundays. On the second Sunday, Johnny, to quote, drank the health, which means he was initiated, to Tony, who in turn drank the same health to Caesar. So we have evidence here of the enslaved Africans using their Obeah to form a secret war society, and they're using the oath to make sure that none of the leaders reveal the secrets. So from the historical record, Sekundi was the historical leader of the planned rebellion. He was initiated by Kweku, an accomplished African-born Akan sage who was feared and respected among the blacks. One prisoner testified that he witnessed Kweku performing secrecy oaths involving cock's blood, sheepskin, rum, and money. So it appears that as long as the more detailed ritual was performed for one person, then you could continue to build the secret group using less complex, simpler initiations along the way. And these rituals were administered in at least 7 different places around Antigua for that particular plot. Importantly, all of the African Creole leaders, and this is an important point, all of the Creole leaders, the ones born in Antigua, not the Africans born in Africa, were also baptized. So this tendency to view baptism as an effective counterforce is seen more explicitly during the post-1800 wars, soon to be discussed. But as should be expected by blacks still acting on an African way of knowing, a way of knowing which didn't mutually exclude other forces or other paths or ways of knowing, collected forces. They collected forces to increase their potency. And baptism was seen as one way of adding to the Obeah, another spiritual force. And they also viewed baptism as a sort of initiation that was controlled by the whites. Kweku, however, he was born in Africa, and he did not see the need, or he did not trust using Christian protective forces alone. He did not control those forces. He did not know about them. And so he used, he did his own rituals. And so he took, the report says that he took a string, he tied knots in the string, and he commanded that as he tied those knots, so the Bakras should become arrant fools and have their mouths stopped, and their hands tied that they should not discover the design of the Africans. So that's Antigua in terms of the, I'm sorry, I think I've gone to the wrong Suriname. All right, one moment. So Sekundi, who was the leader, he asked Kweku as well, who was the spiritual sage. Remember, he said that you always have a leader and you have the sage attached to them. He asked Kweku when should he start the revolt, and Kweku was speaking more as a sage and a military strategist, cautioned him that he should not be in a hurry and that he would give him notice when he should rise. So I'm pointing this out to point out the importance of the Obe sage for leadership and for guidance. That same type of advice is given by Mingo in Barbados in the post-1800 wars. In Antigua, again, this Obe war medicine failed because this 1736 plot was uncovered. And so the African Creole, those sages born in Antigua, they lost confidence in this Obe. And because of that, resistance at the level of widespread conspiracies did not resume in Antigua until 1837. Again, we have the failure of the early African Obe and loss in confidence and then a lull. Again, in Jamaica, the critical role of African sages in collective resistance was also evident in the 1760 revolt. Edward Long, the white historian, tells the story of St. Mary's Parish being on the sage. In St. Mary's Parish, a check was fortunately given at one estate, but by surprising, a famous Obe man or priest was much respected among his countrymen, and revealed that this captured sage, with others, according to Long, with others of his profession, had been a chief in counseling and instigating, according to Long, the credulous herd. Long noting that the rebels were convinced that a powder rubbed into their bodies by the sages made them invulnerable, and they believed that Taki, their generalissimo in the woods, could not possibly be hurt by the white men, for that he caught all the bullets fired at him in his hand and hurled them back with the destruction of his foes. Long understood the actions of the Africans through his own English ways of knowing and disparaged the rebels for being irrational. But Black sages were operating under their own tightly articulated orchestration of knowledge that made sense to them, but was inaccessible to Long as a complete paradigm, even if he could glimpse fragments. Africans in Jamaica during the African phase functioned in an orchestration in which Obe war medicine was extremely real and did not yet have a competing African Creole medicine of any high degree of reality. In other words, even though the African Creoles, those Africans born in Jamaica, were beginning to lose confidence in the obeah produced by Africans, they did not have their own medicine to compete. The whites were also aware that they were fighting a battle in the realm of the invisible and sought to demonstrate their most recent technology of electrical machines to shock the enslaved Africans, the sages, often with little effect in terms of proving that their white obeah was more powerful. Hence, attempts by whites to gain psychological advantage did not work in discrediting the Africans. And the Africans merely viewed the failure of, this is the African-born Africans, the failure of their sages as maybe this particular sage was incompetent, maybe they didn't have the correct materials and so on. But they never questioned their fundamental assumptions about the obeah itself. So it's no wonder that even when General Taki was killed, Long had to admit that, according to the Africans, the fame of General Taki and the notion of his invulnerability still prevailed over the minds of the Africans. In the end, however, Blacks on plantations in Jamaica underwent the same phase transition, born of a loss in confidence in African obeah medicine, the same loss of confidence that occurred in Barbados in 1692, in Antigua in 1736, and now in Jamaica in 1776, the Hanover Revolt. The Hanover Revolt was chiefly formed of Creole Africans. So the general pattern is whenever there was a revolt, you know, over time, the Africans lost, as their plots were revealed, the Creoles, the Africans born in the Caribbean lost confidence in the African obeah. And once that happened, then collective plotting subsided, and the new phase of rebellions did not start until after the 1800s. So you had an interlude where confidence was lost in terms of the inner mysteries of the forces, but that confidence wasn't lost by the Africans who came out of Africa. It was lost by Africans born in the Caribbean, because they did not have the benefit of ever seeing the full infrastructure of these forces and how they worked. During the lull in war, in the obeah, in the production of obeah medicine for war and the actual activity and resistance, what happened is that the sages, the priests, constantly started testing and producing new forces. At the penny whistle level of improvisation, they would try this medicine, try that medicine, and so on. But it was not until the arrival of the missionaries at the end of the 17th century that the Black sages got new elements to include. And they started to include Christian elements into their obeah. For the reason that they believed that what Christians really did in the churches was a type of obeah, and that their rituals could be incorporated, including the Bible and so on. And so they started to incorporate those elements to compose counter forces. So the Black sages, once they started to include, this is the Creole-born baptisms and the Bible and the church structure into the obeah medicine, they had renewed confidence, and they thought now that finally they figured out what the whites were doing in these churches. They had combined the elements with their own work, and that they could challenge the white sorcery or obeah. And so the post-1800 stability was neither a mere consequence of missionaries teaching Blacks to read, as some historians might say, while they intentionally opened their eyes to the unjust conditions, nor was it determined by economics alone. So the Bussa rebellion, Bussa revolt in Barbados reignited the Creole phase. And the Creole phase, at the heart of leadership were enslaved Africans born in the British West Indies. So the 1816 rebellion by Bussa, though it was effectively squashed in 4 days, prompted the whites to replace the 1806 slave control law with an 1818 law that targeted sages who practiced obey. I start with that to point out that the whites at the time knew that this wasn't a rebellion that was just about military strategy and so on, that the obey slaves, as per usual, were at the heart of planning and supporting this rebellion. 2 months after that rebellion, there was another plot. The mood of the enslaved blacks was such that at least one white Barbadian felt that the West Indies was now held by a very precarious tenure that only military strength alone could deal with. That could not be controlled by military strength only. The Barbados Assembly knew what they were doing when they amended the anti-obey laws in 1880. Even though none of the leaders of the 1816 rebellion were explicitly identified as obey men, obey sages were still prevalent and generally known to be powerful and influential in Barbados. It is difficult to conceive that a Black Barbadian community in 1816 would throw up leaders who did not seriously regard the craft and advice of these sages. It is possible that the pre-rebellion party that every historian knows about, the leaders of the Bussa rebellion attended, was not simply a party, but was actually a ritual or a play. They actually call it a play. And we know that the word play is used around the Caribbean, in Suriname, in Jamaica, and so to actually mean a ritual. And in fact, according to Carl Watson, nothing could stop Blacks from attending these functions, of which they were very passionate. So it is my suspicion, the evidence is not as with these things, you don't have direct evidence. We don't know what Africans were actually thinking. That's why we have to use the ontological constructions over time to reproduce what they might have been thinking. But it is my thinking that these plays were a bit more than lines and parties, and that at these plays, ritual activity actually happened. So for the Bussa rebellion, where they say they went to a party before, more likely than not, they actually had rituals. Some of them got baptized before the rebellion. Sandy Waterman, one of the leaders, the rebellion who was executed, he got baptized 6 weeks before the rebellion. In preparing for the Bussa rebellion, Mingo, one of the leaders, and we suspect from a few sources now, may have played the role of a spiritual advisor to Jackie, was overheard telling them that Sunday night, this is Mingo speaking to Jackie, Sunday night next, they were to turn out and give the country a light, and the country would be sure to him as the coat on his back. Now, this sounds similar to the counsel that Kweku had given to Taki in the Antigua 1736 war, to Sekundi, sorry. It sounds more like a divining prediction than a military strategy. Barbadian historian Robert Morris concluded that Blacks had developed a better self-concept. In fact, I think the evidence suggests around that time, Blacks were growing in confidence in Barbados. It was a type of spiritual renaissance. And that the whites had claimed that they now had more exalted ideas of their own value and consequence. I am suggesting that this renaissance produced frequent Saturday and Sunday dances and feasts, but which doubled as well for spiritual work, and that they attended these feasts expensively dressed and gaily attired, to the chagrin of the whites at the time, who were getting worried about the newfound confidence of the Blacks. But I'm also proposing that this surge in confidence is based on the newly composed Obeah forces. These forces included and integrated Christian elements, the Bible and so on, to give added potency to what the Obeah priests were doing, the Obeah sages were doing, in order to counter what they viewed as white Obeah or white sorcery. So the 1818 anti-Obeah law in Barbados was amended to specifically deal with the role of Obeah as a force for insurrection. This is the indicators that the planters at the time felt that it was unwise to ignore this power. So Barbados ignited this round of rebellions. Demerara came next. The Bethel Chapel became the focal point for spiritual work among the Blacks. And you can glimpse something of the spiritual mystique and the new meanings and the uses and the potency ascribed to the Bible when one of the enslaved men were heard to say that the Negroes at Bachelor's Adventure had a Bible to make a promise. In other words, they had a Bible as a special possession for using in their rituals. So on the day before the 1823 rebellion in Demerara, sacrament was given to several of the baptized deacons, including an enslaved man called Paris. He wasn't baptized. But Paris testified that he took part in what seemed to be a secrecy oath involving many Blacks laying hands on the chapel Bible. So here I'm telling you that the Christian elements are now included. While the white Parson Smith, so the white Parson Smith is doing, Parson Smith, who is white and performing this ritual, is not aware that he is unwittingly performing the ritual for the Blacks before the insurrection. Mm-hmm. So several oaths were performed just before that insurrection. On another occasion, an enslaved man opened the Bible and told them all to put their hands upon it and say, "So long as you live, you must not tell any of the white people that freedom has come out for the slaves." It seems to me that the Bible had begun to displace the earlier blood and grave dirt oath that formed part of the ritual preparation for Obeah war medicine. Following their communion, the leaders of this particular insurrection dispersed to other plantations where they deployed other binding oaths involving the Bible. So they went out and continued to develop the secret society that we were always constructing before wars. And the final Creole War was in Jamaica. Again, the Bible was at the center of the insurrection of the Christmas Rebellion or Baptist War. Henry Williams, he was tried for administering illegal oaths, and he made the fighters swear and read out of a book while they're knelt down, the book being the Bible. A large number of Blacks took oaths on the Bible in African style. Now I want to point out that this is a case where there's some creolization, but the creolization is happening at the level of the materials at hand, not the ways of knowing, not the way that Africans constructed the world, because they incorporated the Bible into their way of knowing rather than changing their way of knowing. So that's why I say something like, we have Christians who practice in an African way, right? It took many, many years and education and a system of education and schooling and so on for us to even gradually begin to change the way of knowing. To prove that the African form and intent of these oaths was evident was when two enslaved Blacks, Richard Trail and Thomas Horton, they lined up some men, a number of men, and made them swear on the Bible. Richard had a gun, and he was accompanied by Thomas, who held the Bible. As they walked along the line and promised to blow the brains out of anyone who refused to swear. Now, of course, we know swearing on the Bible is a voluntary thing, according to the Western way of swearing an oath. However, if you're thinking about an oath as an African traditional oath, it's in the act itself and doing it that you get the potency. Once it is done, whether you intend or not. Of course, that could be contested depending on the African ritual and so on. But I'm pointing out that that would have been the thinking. Otherwise, why would you line up men and force them to swear for an oath on the Bible, especially when you're asking them to keep a secret? But these men who were swearing were new, as many Africans knew then, and there's a separate paper that I have written on this, called Tree Warships and Old Warlock and Many Lawless Forces, where an oath for an African is different from an oath for Europeans. An oath in a European court is just swearing to tell the truth and to be honest and morally right and so on. For Africans at the time, if you broke the oath, then they would say you would die, your belly would swell and burst and you would die. So they were not about to break the oath, even if they were asked to perform it at gunpoint. Elite African sages from over 100 estates, many of whom were in the forefront of a spiritual revival, secretly planned the island-wide revolt involving over 60,000 slaves in Jamaica. The revival was most intense in Western Jamaica, where there were numerous Baptist chapels where Black deacons were in control. Blacks used the formal dedication of the Salters Hill Chapel as a form of binding ceremony in preparation for the war. Jamaica had become a crucible for forging new African Creole forces. The leaders were spiritually aware and partly owned and controlled what they felt was white man's obey. The military rank was now in accordance with their rank in the church. Blacks, however, still collected forces in the African way. So as Christians in quotes, they would have kept the African forces. And that's why it drove missionaries mad when they couldn't understand how they would baptize an African today, maybe a Methodist or Moravian baptized. And a mother would bring her child to be baptized by a Moravian, and then the next day if an Anglican priest is nearby, she'd get it baptized by the Anglican priest. Then if a Catholic priest is by, she would take him by the Catholic priest, because Africans collected these forces in the understanding that the more forces you had, the greater the potency of the medicine. This is why John Tharp, as was usually the case with Black rebellions, filled the role of the Obey Sage or Dr. Man in supporting Samuel Sharp, the leader of the uprising. Sharp, as head of the Baptist Church, administered an oath to a large number of enslaved Blacks while telling them that Jesus was their only master. At clandestine meetings, his eloquence convinced other Blacks to join the rebellion. He then performed binding oaths. So he's talking about Jesus, but he's performing obey oaths, right? One of which was to exterminate all of the white and free persons in Jamaica. I'm perfectly aware that the reports that I'm giving are from, these are court cases and so on. And of course, the caveat is that the white planters would exaggerate and say things like they want to exterminate and head all the Africans and so on. But even with that, we still get the gist of what's going on in terms of the obey. Jamaican blacks, having lost confidence in African Obe for war, Obe from the continent, composed new forces using the Bible and other Christian rights at the center. Most importantly, it could be used as a counterforce for the powers of the white man. Matthew Lewis, a white writer, puts it plainly from his observations as late as 1845. He found baptism in high vogue upon Horby Estate, but could not discover much effect produced upon their minds. These are the minds of the Africans. They were being baptized, but they were not behaving in the way that whites thought a Christian should behave. In fact, what they did is that they used the baptism to do things like, after telling a lie, they would conclude by saying, "And now, Massa, you know I've been Christian, and if you do not believe what I say, I'm ready to bust the book to the truth of it." In other words, do a ritual with the Bible to demonstrate that they're telling the truth. Having noted the peculiar manner in which blacks treated baptism and oath swearing upon the Bible as a form of protection from misfortune after they were forced to lie, and the further investigative divinatory purpose to which they put the Bible. So the Africans used the Bible for divining as well. Matthew Lewis observed that they considered Christianity itself to be a superior species of magic that could protect them from black Obe and give them the power of humbugging the white people. They didn't think that white people were superior because the whites were able to uncover much of their work. They felt that the forces that they were manipulating were perhaps superior, and they sought to incorporate that into their rituals to give them the power to humbug the very same white people while protecting them admittedly against other Obe on the plantation. In 2015, Catherine Gerber, I have to give thanks to Jerome Handler for pointing this out to me. She was writing about a Moravian priest where on an estate, on a plantation, where the enslaved Africans actually called him Obe. They named him Obe. And that was because of his position in and the role that he was playing as a Christian. And they went to him for rituals and so on. But they also understood, using an African lens or African way of knowing, they understood what Christians were doing, whatever they were doing, to really be just another type of the spiritual work that we're doing, but owned by white people. So they viewed it as a war of forces, Obe against Obe. The enslaved man, I'm soon wrapping up, the enslaved man, John Morris, was sure that the reason why the rebels missed when they shot at the light infantry of the whites was because they did not pray daily to God Almighty for success. While George Taylor thought that the rebellion should be postponed until all the Negroes were put to their oath. It is probably not coincidental that the major rebellions in Demerara, Jamaica, Barbados, they broke out on the days or during sacred festivals. In all probability, these are Christian festivals. In all probability, Black sages felt that these times aligned spiritual powers to ensure success. This is perhaps why the Baptists were told that even though they could shed blood during the Baptist War, they must not do it on Sundays. Further, they were urged not to spill blood because if we do, it will bring a prosecution upon their church. For Blacks, blood sacrifice was used for powerful spiritual work and had many taboos. So to wrap up, we can see the pattern of African-led rebellions driven by African Obe, the lull of activity due to a loss of confidence in that particular orchestration, composing counterforces that included Christian elements, and then finally a resurgence in activity with Creole Obe at the center, the Africans born in the Caribbean at the center. We understand this pattern differently now. Yes, it is possible that there could be external reasons along with the fact that there were class and elite issues, class conflicts. But I want to propose that this was an important pillar, an important driver in that pattern of resistance, lull, and then a resurgence of resistance. And to conclude, I want to say I treat West African powers as real in the Caribbean. Often we study them as important cultural or religious formations, which means that we don't study them on the scientific side. We buy into the Western culture versus nature, science versus society formulation. And I treat African spiritual forces as real. So the distinction between the knowing West anchored in a unified scientific reason and the believing West who trust in many cultures and is therefore refused. The Caribbean sages, today we are still composing. When I speak of sages, I'm speaking about our poets, our artists, our priests, but especially our artists, because if you go back to that place where we talk about liminality, that place of silence between musical notes where we struggle to create new things. These are the people that we need to guide us, even with our sciences. We are still orchestrating our new civilization, still using old ways of knowledge. And to paraphrase a sacred African proverb, everything between heaven and earth could be ours, so let us reach for the good. This is my tribute to Yemaya. And a funny thing happened on this day, because I have my cell phone in my pocket as I walk into that water. So the cost for tribute to Yemaya is one cell phone on that day and some flowers. Thank you for listening. And I'm ready to entertain any questions.
Yes, first I would like to congratulate Derek for this piece of work, which obviously is a work in progress one. It is also part of a larger work. And it is very interesting the way how you have addressed much of what we know, those of us who are familiar with the history of slave resistance, particularly since the 18th century. I have not heard an approach to slave resistance like that, at least not before. What I remember, let me give you an experience when I was completing the PhD. When I left secondary school in the late 1970s, some of the more important books around was The Wretched of the Earth. And I bought a copy. Just as soon as I got a job, I was one of the several books I purchased. So if you're familiar with Wretched of the Earth, the Jean-Paul Sartre version, I struggled through that introduction by Jean-Paul Sartre. And after I struggled with not understanding anything at all, I'm just out of sixth form, I'm planning to go to university. And after I struggled through the introduction, I reached Concerning Violence. What is this? And then I think I went to, when I couldn't find my way through the first 5 or 6 pages, I think I went to Spontaneity, Strengths and Weaknesses. And ooh, nothing until I gave up reading the book for a long time. When I reach university now, with my experience of that 5 or 6 years before, I'm at university and Mr. Bob said, he said, look, you understand the colonial question in 3 ways. One, from Gandhi says non-violence. Fanon says the history of the colonial rule is extremely violent and it requires one act of supreme violence to overthrow it. And Garvey said, forget about the colonial question, back to Africa. So that's how I went through modern political thought in second year. Until you're finishing the PhD dissertation, and I am realizing, and you didn't discuss it in this case, that the revolutionaries of Haiti, and in my case, Grenada, saw the colonial rule as inherently violent and it requires an act of extreme violence to overthrow it. So I said, but that is what Fanon is saying. So I went back and I went back on the second floor in the library and I fished out a copy of Wretched of the Earth. And when I began to read, I hadn't read it for about 4 or 5 years. But when you began to read, it was so clear and so simple to read it. I could not believe why I was unable to understand it since 1978 when I began to read it. I couldn't. And I was looking at it from that, in that sense, that in the Haiti experience, colonialism was inherently violent and it required an act of extreme violence to overthrow it. I was wondering, why is it that you did not address your discussion seems focused on the, what should I say, the pre-1760, pre-1763 Anglophone Caribbean or the British Caribbean. I did not see, well, very little reference, if any at all, on what about those territories which were acquired in what are called the so-called ceded islands from 1763, where there were different set of rules. And you put me up now on something which was a big thing in my dissertation. Another anecdote, Professor Beckles is supervising my doctoral dissertation. And he read what I wrote for about a month, and he said, you need to engage Genovese. And I'm sitting there and I said, I dare not ask Professor Beckles which Genovese book he is referring to. So as soon as we finished the discussions, I went to the library. So when I put it in the catalog, it says, which book is Beckles referring to? So I look down the list that says, From Rebellion to Revolution. That's it. And when you began to read Genovese's work, everything that you've been reading for the past 7 years about Fidon's rebellion began to make sense. Now, I'm not so sure if you are aware that there was a bit of a debate between Creighton and Genovese on this very same question. And Creighton is arguing that the French Revolution, well, to go it another way, Genovese is arguing that the pattern of slave resistance in the Americas changes with the coming of the French Revolution, whereas people, the Africans, adopted what is called restorationism, which the Africans would escape from maroon settlements, quilombos, and where they would recreate traditional African society as best they could. When the French Revolution came, they became what Creighton called part of the worldwide bourgeois democratic revolution. So Creighton say, no way, Genovese, that didn't make no sense. He said the French Revolution reached the blacks in an indistinct way and indirect. But I am reading in my own work on Fidon's Rebellion, the French, the Grenadian revolutionaries knew the Marseillaise 4 months before France adopted as a national anthem. They were wearing all the revolutionary cockades and knew all the slogans and everything. Well, how did they not know about the French Revolution and France? So it's in that point I was wondering why you did not address that part of the British Caribbean, particularly that part which was brought into the British Empire after 1762 or 1763, where there are different dynamics with regards African spirituality. And there were a lot of people who were in the British Caribbean, especially that was the second British Empire then, that new part of the empire after 1762, where there was a lot of, there were a lot of Africans who were actually born in Africa and who, as I'm arguing in my work, exerted a cultural influence over the revolutionary struggle in Grenada, in my particular case. So that doesn't take away from some real interesting stuff that I was hearing from in your work. I've never seen, or what should I say, thought about approaching it from that angle. But and you whetted my appetite for to discuss for additional work and readings on what you have what you're doing.
You know, it's entirely possible that there are all types of influences. It's entirely possible that there are all types of influences that contribute to the pattern. But I'm with Creighton in that, and with Hillary, that if I'm going to look for the influences for the pattern, I'm looking at intrinsic triggers. So for example, in Suriname, the reason why resistance was kept up is because of their diviners and sages. They had divination happening every single day. It was the sages who reminded them who they were. You know, don't allow yourself to be sucked into this as a normal life. This is not the norm. This is not who we are. And that happens through divining. I think that the same thing happened on the British West Indies plantation. And, you know, I don't see any evidence, actually, I don't see any evidence, even though people try to say so. In the Buster Rebellion, for example, of the court documents or the historical records saying that they were influenced by Haiti. Some indirect references, 1 or 2 lines were made. But
yes, Nanny, is it Nanny Gregg?
Yeah, Nanny Gregg.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and you know, revolutions of war obey revolutions in ways of knowing and so on. Very often happen, you know, changes in the patterns and so on, very often happen because people have had a fundamental change in the way that they view things or they view the world.
Mhm.
And I'm not convinced that the Haitian Revolution exerted enough force and power to so completely affect of influence the resurgence of Creole wars. In other words, some people say the enslaved in Barbados and Jamaica and Guyana, they heard about this revolution in Haiti, and then they decided they were inspired and they got up and they start to, and they organized and so on.
I don't quite agree with that, Derek. I don't quite agree with that.
I would suggest that, but I don't see it in the evidence. I would suggest what I see in the evidence is lots and lots of talk about spiritual work, obey priests doing work, obey oaths, and so on. That's what I see in the, but I would not, but my type of philosophy does not exclude contributions from other forces.
I would go back to CLR James. You don't need any ideology to have no idea for freedom.
But CLR James speaks about Black Jacobins. I disagree with him with that. You didn't need there are some scholars that say that CLR James does not ascribe enough agency concerning concepts of freedom and so on to the African sages like Boukman and so on, who were there at the center of the Haitian Revolution. Maybe they got some influence somewhere along the line from the French Revolution and so on. But I think I have a problem with the term Black Jacobins, to be honest with you. Because
I can understand that. But what I'm saying is that you don't need no Haitian revolution to make you want to be free.
Right, okay.
That's the point I'm on. That's the point.
Right,
and
guys,
the same thing applies to Barbados, the same thing applies to Grenada. You don't need, you are enslaved, you're a piece of property, and you want to address what is your social condition, which is oppressive. And you need to find a way to deal with it. You don't need to know what's happening in Haiti for that.
All right, guys, we have some questions from the audience that I think we should try to get to a few of them. So this one is from Mr. Jacob on Facebook. He asks, what was the average age of the enslaved Africans when they started their enslavement in Barbados compared to the average age of Africans at the start of their respective enslavement in other territories in this part of the world? What was the average age of the enslaved African who was very knowledgeable in the traditional African religion or spiritual practices?
I don't know the average. I don't know the average age. I know they were young. They were young men, most often, 18 in their early 20s, and then they were worked to death, especially in the early days, in the early years. I can't give him. I'd have to go look at the statistics to see. Somebody like Barry Higman, who specializes in demographics and so on, would probably be able to give him that answer. But if the point he's making, if he's wondering whether the sages had learned enough about their practices to reproduce them in Barbados, maybe not. You sometimes when you are being trained as a sage, you're trained from very young.
Yes.
So that by the time you're 18 years old, you already have 10, 15 years of experience. So and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The fact is that there were actually obeah rituals and so on being performed. So whoever arrived here at whatever age, they had some knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. This one is from David Gibbs. He asks, how involved was the Christian church in encouraging the government of the day to pass anti-obeah laws?
I don't know. I didn't see any documentation. I didn't see any evidence. I haven't read any evidence of the church having a specific influence. I know the anti-obeah laws were first. Barbados thought that we were safe. We didn't have any worries about plots and revolutions. Remember, our last plot was 1701. Jamaica had the anti-obeah laws first. I think it was 1760. Jerome Hadler would have to correct me. I'd have to check. again, but they had the laws first and Barbados copied from them. But when Barbados copied, we just copied wholesale just after the Bussy Rebellion. But then after there was a plot shortly after again, I suspect that the whites in Barbados realized that the Obe priests were really at the center of advising the rebels. And so the law was specifically adjusted to target diviners and their paraphernalia. And you know, we had by that time we had Obe priests on almost every plantation still. Exerting influence, and by the way, not all of them were called Obe priests either. They realized that they were competing with European doctors. European doctors were competing with them professionally, and so they started to call themselves doctors rather than Obe priests.
And the other point, Derek, I would also suggest what you're speaking. I was thinking about it. If we go back to the first plot, when Governor or the Huddersall, that was but when she informed the master about the plot that was going on, it may be worthwhile to see what exactly took place there, what information was gathered, to see if there were any, spiritual leaders at the forefront.
You mean for the one with Fortuna? But there isn't much documentation evidence for that, except that. And that was the one where the priest asked, I believe that was the one where the priest asked for water to tell the secret, to reveal the secrets. And that's the only reference really to anything that may be spiritual.
Now, talking about the 17th century, 17th century plot.
Which one?
Mm-hmm. One when Huddersall, I think, was the plantation owner.
Oh.
And the slave informed her master because she didn't want her master to get killed.
Mm.
If you could go back and see what exactly took place there, or what information had been gathered, because I'm wondering how we can wait until 1700s or even the early 1800s to find evidence of that. It is likely to be there, but not necessarily.
All right, we have a follow-up question from the same one that I would have asked just now. How prevalent is African traditional spirituality in Barbados today? And what are your views on the importance of religious tolerance to our national development?
Well, I can't give you a specific figure in terms of number of people being initiated or getting involved with African spirituality. Of course, we have to define what we're talking about. You want to go back as early as Granville, or you want to talk about the recent. I know Lag Agba, who was initiated in Trinidad as one of the early Orisha followers. Then the Pinelands Creative Workshop, several members, including myself, would have been initiated. Since then, we've had virtually an explosion of people interested in being initiated in Orisha and other African traditions. We have Michael, who is from the Dagara tradition. So we have spiritual Baptists as early as then till now, and of course they're along different spectrum in terms of Creolized African-derived forms to more African forms. So the second part of the question, how important is the word used was tolerance. I don't know that we should tolerate each other. I think that we need to understand that it's not the question. That question is not so difficult to answer from an African worldview, because as I said several times, the African worldview is that we live in a hybrid reality where we extract different paths to knowledge and truth, or different paths to the divine. Whereas there are other traditions, mostly Christianity, Islam, where there's only one path. I wouldn't speak authoritatively and definitively on that, but from the gathering, they're exclusive. So from an African traditional point of view, all of these forces can coexist with different technologies, spiritual technologies for spiritual development, and work collectively for greater potency. That is the African way of collecting forces. And I think that that's if you want to live in harmony and peace, that's the only way, because Christians are not going to disappear, Muslims are not going to disappear, the African traditional indigenous religions are not going to disappear, spirituality, they're not going to disappear. And the best example of that I can give you as a form of, without carrying on the answer for too long, in African traditions, we commune with the ancestors, and they're often ancestral altars. And if you go to Trinidad, for example, we'd wonder, well, how come on this ancestral altar, there's a Christian cross, there's a Muslim, there's a Quran, there's a Christian Bible, there's the symbols and Hindu symbols, there's Orisha symbols. And well, the fact is that all of these ancestors, while they were alive, they followed different paths. And when you're honoring them and communing with them, you put you don't disrespect them by putting things from other faiths to them. You honor them with what they followed. And I think that we could take that example for our own lives and how we live as societies.
Yes, Derek, I remember a man telling me because I don't think when that person lived there. You ever heard about a chap called Paniza in Trinidad?
No, I never heard.
Oh, that's what you will call now Orisha. But somebody who went to see him, that person himself has since passed, said that when you go to his shrine, you saw representations of every major religion. And they asked that same question, why is it that he has all of these? And it's for that reason. So that is part of the African way of viewing the world. But other religious bodies or other religions, you could say, don't necessarily have that view of things.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. This one is from Kevin Talma. He asks, can you describe the physical spaces can you describe the physical spaces would have been like where there were activities would have taken place? For example, the Christians would have been in a church. Would the Africans practicing Obia have had a significant place or configuration of space to practice, or was that not important?
Oh,
that's an interesting one.
The Africans would have, in terms of ancestral communion, there was a time when the dead were buried in the floor of the house or close on the compound. So ancestral communion would have been close around your property in the open. Much of the African traditions and nature traditions, so out in the open, in the yard, is probably just as good or better than inside in a house. And of course, the enslaved did not and would not have had the resources to build churches and so on. Having said that, the enslaved Africans, once churches were built, once they had an opportunity to go in, went into the churches. But once they were in the churches, it didn't necessarily mean that the only thing that they were practicing in the churches was Christianity. They would have been practicing their spirituality and incorporating the Christian elements. And even today, African traditions will incorporate and use elements from other traditions, including Christianity, including their spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is one of the part of the origins of the Shouter Baptist movement in Trinidad. They were part of the Baptist. When I say Baptist, I mean the London Baptist Missionary Society type of Baptist, that from England. But then they began to practice their own type of Christianity, so to speak. And by about 1900, 1901, the official London Baptist Missionary Society cast them out and told them that they couldn't, they couldn't practice their religion there anymore. that has happened. But as I was making the point some years ago, that is how the Christian church developed, not so? After Christ was crucified and the early church was part of that one body until it went from, well, the ancient Judaism, so to speak, and it went to Christianity. But at one point, they shared the same places of worship. Only after there was a parting of the ways. This is not too distant, it's a not too different scenario in Trinidad in the early 20th century. You share the same places, and then when it got too obvious, one went one way and the other one the other way. From their own, well, one formed their own bodies and the other, and the original one remained there. It has happened.
To give Kevin a takeaway, you know, African traditional spiritualities are often practiced in open spaces and in nature, and Christianity would have been in the churches and so on, or in open spaces and in nature, or in your homes.
Well, we have the original New Testament, where two or more are gathered in my name, there may I be also. That could be anywhere.
All right, I think that pretty much wraps up our question and answer segment. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the questions tonight, but we hope that you did enjoy the lecture. Mr. Jacobs, I don't know if you want to give our vote of thanks and then we can wrap up.
Well, I'm not so sure who I'm supposed to thank. Maybe Dr. Carter for inviting me to take part in this. I'll have to say an eye-opening experience. I didn't realize that's the kind of work Derek has been doing in Barbados, and it sounds to me as rather interesting. And I would like to, have a little, be more, what should I say, informed or become, more involved in this type of work. I myself am doing, work with respect to that, but of course we are in different parts. So I would like to thank the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, as well as the Department of History of the University of the West Indies at Cave Hill for inviting me to participate in this event. And I would like to thank all of you who participated in one way or the next in this most interesting exercise. Thank you.